Okay guys, so in this video we are going to talk about scaling, so let's get into it. So I'm going to talk to you about one of the most common scaling issues that we have when it comes to frontend and how we can design our base components to avoid it. So when it comes to frontend development, one of the things that you should know is that when a project is fairly small, this is very rarely an issue, but as a company grows and more people are added to the company and you have more people working on different stories and different teams over a large code base, things of this nature, you're going to see something like an emerging pattern, and that is that speed and laziness always wins. And the thing that I basically mean by that is that in a perfect world, we would have standard components for everything that we do, and the sad fact is that we don't. And I know that there is this hype around reusable components especially in frontend, and I can tell you that for the most part this is absolute bullshit. And it is bullshit because it's extremely hard to design standard components. The reason is very simple, because unless you know so well what the use case today is and what the use case tomorrow is going to be for the component that you are designing, and what the needs of a person who's going to consume what the needs of that person is, you will simply create a component that is right for today, but it's very unlikely that you will have the foresight to be able to design it in such a way that the next person coming around or who's going to consume it is going to be able to use it for whatever it is that they need, right? And then they're going to do that magical thing that every single developer does at some point, and that is that they are going to make a cost value analysis between using your awesome standard thing and just doing something from scratch. Because the sad fact of the matter is that it's pretty much always easier to build something from scratch than it is to modify something that already exists. Now, I'm going to show you an approach to how to solve this permutation problem, because trust me, it's very easy to get to a point where you have multiple versions of a button and you have multiple versions of a tooltip or a dialog or any of these standard components, right? And that's something we want to avoid, right? We want to keep, I guess, a very narrow circle of standard components that we can very easily display and then build on top of, right? Consistency is good, right? So let's have a look at my little server here. Nothing super interesting here. And then I have this very basic little static website server thing, which we built in Express, and it's just going to serve up 2 static files. We're going to touch on what lib is, but this is basically my application, right? And in my application, which is super fancy, there's 3 buttons, and if I click this button, you see a little amazing dialog here that is worthy of some type of design prize. And if I click on the buttons, they go away. And if I click here, it's going to say, oh my god, and it's going to say, oh my god, on this as well. So my fancy, amazing application is that simple. I'll just show you the basics as well, like the boilerplate that we use to set this up. So I'm just using TypeScript with the TS loader. And here is the configuration. And that's pretty much it. So let's have a look at the main file here. So this is just my entire application right now, which is super trivial. We have an application state, we have some like a constructor for our component, we have a function that shows a dialog, on cancel is going to hide it, and on confirm is also going to hide it. And then we have a few buttons and a dialog. And then finally we render out everything to the DOM. So this is my fancy application. So I'm just going to walk you through a scenario now. So let's say that I am working on a feature somewhere in my application. I might start and say, hey, you know what? I'm going to create a button. I need a button and I need it really quickly. And then I basically go here and I say, all right, I'll create some base styles. Like, yeah, these are my base styles just for the sake of argument. And we're going to touch on that as well because that's very dangerous. And then I create some base styles and I say, hey, you know what? My button needs to be red. So I'll just create this button like quickly now because I basically need to just ship this as quickly as possible. Said and done, I create my button. Now, the problem with this is that a button is very naturally a standard component. Now, if I'm in a very early stage of my project, I don't care about standardizing my components because it's way too early to start thinking about standardization. But what's then at some point going to happen is that a like the next developer who is most likely working on some of the team, they're working on some of the part of the process, they may not even be aware of your amazing button that you just created, right? They're going to have a slightly different use case. They're going to say, all right, I need a button, but this button is red. And I don't want my button to be red. It has to be something else. It has to be a different color. All right, cool. So I could take the risk of going into your amazing button here that you created and like fix it and like make it more generic or complicated so that it, works for my use case and your use case. But I don't really like that. That's kind of dangerous. So this is not going to work for me. I'm just going to play it safe because I have a sharp deadline. I don't have time to sit and fix your code and then my code as well, because it's a risk for me, because if it goes wrong, I'm going to have to be delayed and stuff. So you know what? I'm just going to create another button and I'm going to copy paste all your code. And then I'm going to do this. I'm going to make it blue instead. Now, of course, I'm exaggerating this, but this is the scenario I just played through with you is you have no idea how common this is. It happens like almost on a daily basis. So what basically just happened is that we have started creating this pattern, this trend of permutations of buttons. Some people are going to try to refactor your button, like an existing button, and then make it into something that they can use, plus that you can use. Some people are just going to skip the risk and they're going to try to create like their own version, their own permutation, and this just keeps on happening, right? And at some point, somebody is going to say, you know what? We should standardize this. Every single company has one or a few people who are going to say this. And then they're going to start the standardization process. And the thing is that they're going to realize very quickly, most of the time, is that this is really, really hard. Especially when you have, depending on how many permutations you have. Because basically what it means is that if you have a button that, in this case, it's very trivial. To fix a button that has a different color is very easy. But if you have a margin or you have something that has to do with positioning on the page, things of this nature, it's actually very tricky for you to just change that button to a standard component without making like one super component that basically needs to cater for all the cases. You're basically just changing code. You're not improving it because you don't know which context this button is used in. So if you can't just arbitrarily remove some padding or some space like margin without the risk of actually breaking it. So creating these standard components in hindsight is actually a fairly big investment because you need to not only go and fix it for all you need to basically go and verify all the places where this button is used. That's pretty much that's what your job is. And when you have figured out, okay, these are all the places where this is being used, then you have to figure out, how can I make this into a standard thing without the need of like custom margins and custom spacings and like all of this stuff, right? How can I do that? And if you're really unlucky, you can't, because the design of that page is right at that moment, depending on that button is in that exact state that you found it in. And then your plan on making a standard component just falls through, right? Because the work and effort to fix it is too high. So now I will show you a way that I find to be very useful to use in order to approach this sort of problem. So let's say that I had these buttons here and I realized that I don't like this. We're starting down a slippery slope here. Well, you know what? Let me create a button that I'm going to use, and I'm going to create a variant system. I'm going to create a standard, like in its base form, it's going to be the thing that we should use 99% of the time, but it also has to support the ability of some sort of customization. But I want to control that customization because these are the things that are dangerous. When a developer decides to use custom CSS on a standard component, that's where you get all of these deviations. And that's the thing we want to avoid. So by allowing deviations or permutations, but in an extremely controlled manner, I'm basically giving people the option of, I'm controlling the permutations or like the entropy of the different custom components so we don't duplicate code, but I'm at the same time allowing for the fact that you need that flexibility to sometimes create another permutation of something without, necessarily duplicating code or any of this stuff, right? So the variant system is basically, you probably have seen this in other frameworks, or like other more serious frameworks that are extremely popular. Bootstrap uses this approach just with CSS. Material UI does it as well for React. They have a few like buttons and stuff like that that uses a variant system, and it's a very, very good system. It's an extremely useful system. I swear by it, like truly. So all you do is that you create an enumeration or a string. You can use whatever you want basically, and you say these are my variants of the standard component. And then you create some type of interface if we're in TypeScript, and I say, all right, so there's an optional variant here. Now, basically all I need to do now is that I need to look at the variant that this button is taking. And then I have this function here that takes in a variant, and all it's going to do is that it's going to return the styles that are associated with that variant. So I can maintain the same component, the same amount of code, but and just remove all that duplication that would start to happen if people kept on creating new buttons. By simply adding a new case here, I can cover that case of, all right, you need a different style of something. And then I have this little function here that just throws an error if you try to pass in something that isn't actually legal. So let's look at primary button style, steel blue, and then we have Rebecca purple, and then we have our base style. So the base styles, as I said earlier, this is one of those things that are truly dangerous. You really need to talk to your design team, or like really have a good understanding of what a standard like base button is going to be, because it's such an easy thing for someone to come around and say, yeah, you know what, our buttons, they are a little bit poofy, they're a little bit thick, we should reduce the padding or something like that. And as soon as you do that, it becomes a little bit of a hassle to, like, changing a base style is it's a dangerous thing on a big application. But basically what we've done now is that we can change this color here, like we can create as many variants as we want. So we can simply say secondary, like that, and it's going to recompile, and now it's purple instead. Amazing, right? So this is a very simple example. Like a button is one of those base cases where, all right, this is it's such a simple thing to do from the perspective of creating a variant. But you can stretch this further into another case, which is where you have something a little bit more complicated, where you may not just have a variant in something like styling, because styling is, as we kind of see here, it's very low risk for you. I mean, changing the color of a button is like, the odds of you breaking something is very, very low. And the same thing goes for the interface. The interface is always going to be the same. I mean, a button really only has the common attributes. Like each of them are going to have the same attributes, and one click, like a click handler or something like that. But let's have a look at this dialog thing. So a dialog is actually a surprisingly complicated component, because depending on the need of the dialog, you're going to have it in different states. So sometimes you want to have a header with a cross so that the user can cancel. Sometimes you want a footer where you can cancel and say OK. Sometimes you want a footer that only says OK. And sometimes there shouldn't be a header. These sorts of questions, like these permutations, these are extremely common. And in order for you to accommodate all of those, you have basically two choices. Either you create a permutation for each version of this, which is kind of this pattern here, or you create something, something like a variant system. And the variant system is, in my opinion, one of the, like, my personal favorite way of approaching this. So let's look at the dialog. So here's my dialog. It has an on cancel, an on confirm, a show, an optional header, and an optional footer, some CSS properties, some container styles like this, and here it renders it all out. So if we're saying that it shouldn't be shown, then it's just going to return null. And then we check, should we hide the header? And the reason why I'm hiding the header is basically because I'm doing a bit of height calculations here for like where the content area should actually be fitted. And then we create a div, like the dialog styles, and then we have the container. Here we put our header, and here is the content, like where we're actually going to put the content of the header, and here is the footer. So just from looking at this, we now have the option of creating, all right, we have a header and we have a footer, and we can also express that we don't want one or the other. So I can see here, right, okay, so I have a header and some content, and then I have a footer. But I could also say this. I can just do that, refresh the page, and now there's no header. I can also say, hey, I don't want that. I want one that is completely, well, this should be like that. So, well, now you can't even close it because I haven't actually added a cancel on the backdrop here, or the background. But you kind of get my drift, right? Like, I've created a dialog that can support all of these different permutation needs that we could possibly have. And that makes this component flexible enough that it can be used in pretty much any context, because we know that a standard dialog will have these three. Will want to have a header section, a content section, and a footer section, but it may not want them all at the same time or in the same shape as depending on situation, right? So that's one part of this variant system. So then we have this, the dialog header and the dialog footer, which is the next thing. Okay, we were saying that, right, sometimes we want a footer as an example, but we don't want a footer that has two buttons. So we have cancel. I mean, our designer's going to come in and he's going to say, or she's going to say, hey, you know, why do we have a cancel there? We have a cancel up here as well. And you kind of go, well, yeah, that's true. Maybe we should just have an OK button. All right, said and done. Let's say that this is a variant of confirm. So now we get a compilation error. And the compilation error here is saying that property on cancel does not exist on type dialog footer. Now let's investigate that for a moment. What the hell is happening here? So let's have a look. This is where TypeScript, in my opinion, this is one of my favorite things about TypeScript. So I can basically declare these variants in the same way as I've done before, as I showed you with the button. But I can also do this. I can create a type, an explicit type variant of the different variants that I have. So I can basically say that I can create an interface that will only be valid depending on what I put in the variant variable. So here I'm saying that, all right, so my interface for my dialog footer is going to be that it needs an onCancel function and an onConfirm function if the variant is cancel confirm. If it's just confirm, I just need the confirm, because in that scenario I don't actually need the onCancel function. And then we have some CSS, and here is the rest of it, where I'm basically explicitly checking, is this a cancel confirm? Well, if it is, then I want to add an onClick that is going to do onCancel, and then I'm going to just set the variant on my button to secondary. That's going to be my cancel, and then I'm going to show my confirm. But if it's not cancel confirm, in other words, it's just confirm, I'm just going to show this button. So that's a conditional, there's a conditional rendering going on here. So if I just remove this here, now it's going to compile. And I go to my page, I click, and now I only have the OK button. So this is just this is another way where I can illustrate how you can use a variant system, and you don't have to have TypeScript for this, but it's very nice to have this sort of compilation feedback. But with the variant system, I can actually express different footers. So I have a very flexible dialog where I can say, do you want a footer or don't you want a footer? But I'm also passing in a footer where I can say what type of footer I actually want. So this becomes even easier, because if somebody comes in and says, hey, you know what, we need a third button for this footer, they can simply go in and stand on this component, add another permutation. They shouldn't. I mean, we should really fight for standards, but if they have to, they can actually go in and extend it onto this component fairly easily. And then we can look at the header. Very similar thing here, where there's just one version of this header, which is cancel, that there is a header that has a cancel button. We could extend it with like a header title section or something like that. And the same thing goes here. Like, we basically just render this out, right? So this is the basic idea of having a variant system. So ideally, as I said, you should be able to standardize things into just one or two, a few components without having to create all these permutations. But it's better for you to account for the fact that people are going to have different use cases. And the best thing for you in order to achieve these standards is if you can control very explicitly what they're allowed to do. What your goal is to make it very unfeasible or very hard to create your own one-off solution, because if you can force people to go through the same standard component pipeline, it becomes easier for you to manage all the permutations of different components that you actually get. And that makes it's a very powerful thing, because then you can build even more advanced components as you go along. All you really have to kind of embrace here is this you can think of it as a configuration system. You have components that can be configured with different behavior. And in order for you to achieve this, you simply express through some type of variant system and a type system, if you have one, that, all right, this is a component that needs these things, this is a component that needs these things are optional, etc., etc. You can think of it as a configuration. So hopefully this was useful to you. Have a great day.